Mary Gay was known as a woman of conviction and determination. She was born in Milledgeville in 1829. Her father died when she was very young, and she and her mother moved to Decatur.
Her mother was married twice, lost 2 husbands, but they were fairly well-to-do, not filthy rich, but quite comfortable. The mother, at the time of her second marriage, ended up moving to Decatur, a small farming and marketing community 10 miles from the small but growing transportation town of Atlanta.
She came to Decatur as a young woman to get an education, and so she was living in Decatur before the Civil War broke out.
She went to female seminaries. She was obviously quite well educated at home. And in school, she had a very strong religious training. She was a Baptist by faith.
She saw herself as being a poet and a writer and an author. And so she busied herself by writing poetry and little essays and stories. And in the 1850s, she published her own book called Prose and Poetry by a Southern Lady. Now, in those days, it wasn't quite proper for a lady to write a book, so she didn't sign her name to it. But of course, everyone knew it was her.
In the summer of 1864, Mary Gay's life changed radically. The war came to their front and backyard. While no battles were fought in Decatur, Decatur was quickly overrun by the Union troops and became their supply headquarters. Union officers ordered many families out of town. They took over all the food commandeered by Yankee troops. Anything that was silver was taken. Anything that was wooden was broken up for their campfires.
You know, the Union soldiers wanted in their house, and she didn't want to go, and then she's going all these places trying to find food, not just for her family, but for other families that she heard might be hungry.
Mary knew if she left the house that she and her mother would have nothing, because they had invested everything they had in Confederate bonds. And so by her standing up to the Union soldiers, she was fighting her own personal war.
In the spring of 1864, her brother contacted her and said, "We have these winter uniforms and it's getting warm. We don't have anywhere to put them." Because of course the South didn't have a standing army like the North did. They didn't have warehouses and processes for dealing with an army. So she said, "Don't worry, Tommy, I will take care of this." She went out to visit him and gathered up all the uniforms, put them on a cart, came home. Now, follow me this way and I'll show you what she did with the uniforms. She came here into the dining room, and you see how high the ceilings are here in the dining room. She pulled the furniture up against the wall, the table, a high boy, climbed up. She had a broomstick, and she poked a hole in the ceiling. Then she and her mother got the uniforms, put them up in the hole, back up in the ceiling so you couldn't see it.
Meanwhile, the Yankees were all in and out of the house every day. Finally, though, came August. The battle was over. The Southerners were having to abandon Atlanta to the Yankees and retreat north. Hood's troops needed their winter garments back. It would soon be fall, and they would need the protection of their uniform and winter coats. So she repeated the process of stealthily at night getting the coats back out of the thing, putting them back in crates, hauling them into town, and getting them back to the troops. And they were ever so grateful. And they shook her hand and bowed and said she was a true daughter of the South.
Now, after that little bit of heroism, the Yankees finally decided to leave. And of course, they did their famous March to the Sea, starting here in Atlanta and in Decatur, and they marched all the way to Savannah. Well, they decided to leave at night for some reason. So on their way out, of course, there were no street lights in those days. They just set fire to every 4th or 5th house, just so they could see at night to march out of town.
Mary Gay was continuing her fight for the people of Decatur. Her brother Tommy was killed during the war, and with her brother's widow, nephew, and half-sister to support, she decided to republish her 1858 book, Prose and Poetry by a Southern Lady, selling it door to door to earn their living.
I really think that once the war was over, Tommy was gone, and her mother died of the stroke. Mary realized that she had to pull everything up by the bootstrap and make her life
She had, as I said, published at least one of her books of poetry, self-published it, and had just sort of handed out copies to friends before the war. Now she had another group of volumes published and sold them door to door. She smartly went up to places like Norfolk, Virginia, all over northern Tennessee and Kentucky and Maryland, areas that had been not quite so devastated during the war.
Newly titled The Pastor's Story, it was a hodgepodge of melancholy girlish poetry and morally uplifting essays.
Well, somehow it also found its way into the hands of a better-known American writer, Mark Twain. And if you get a copy of Tom Sawyer, there is a scene in Tom Sawyer where the school children are doing recitations.
It's awful poetry. Mark Twain means to just sort of lay waste to the pretentiousness and ridiculousness of a staid Victorian culture. And he admits in the novel Tom Sawyer, at the end of the chapter, he says, "I couldn't have written poetry this bad. I have plagiarized it from a book that he calls Prose and Poetry by a Western Lady." Thank goodness he leaves it anonymous and tries ever so slightly to disguise the book he stole it from.
But the indignant Miss Gay, calling Twain a literary humbug in the preface to a later copy, saw her book go through 11 editions, at least in part due to her perseverance and tenacity in marketing it. It financially provided for her small family during the difficult years of Reconstruction.
She wrote a book in the 1880s called Life in Dixie During the War, which is how I know so much about her. One of the few accounts of what it was like to be on the home front in the South during the war. All the generals wrote books about the battles, and everybody knows all about that. But this is a really interesting first-hand account of how people actually got by.
She wrote Life in Dixie During the War for her nephew, and she wanted him to understand what it was like.
She wanted to leave him with stories about his father's bravery, about everything the family had done during those exciting and harsh times of the 1860s.
Mary Gay lived the Civil War, and when we think about that particular era of history, we know Sherman, we know Lee, we know Meade, we know the battle of this and the battle of that, and yet here was this woman right in the middle of all of it who lived it in a way that none of us could comprehend.
Mary Gay's efforts were directed at providing for more than her own family. In addition to helping the women and children of Decatur survive, she helped secure funds for several major projects.
The people who were forming First Baptist Church of Decatur commissioned Mary Gay, whom they dubbed as the Worthy Sister, to go traipsing around Kentucky and Middle Georgia to raise funds.
She must have faced an awful lot of resistance from men, but she used her intelligence as well as using areas that women could work in. Women could be associated with religion. You could sell Bibles. You could fundraise for religious organizations. You could sell your own book. She very smartly figured out the parameters of what would be acceptable and then stretched the edge of that envelope.
The building that was built with the money that Mary Gay raised was located originally at the corner of Church Street and Trinity Place in Decatur, and it's known in our church and historically as the Little Red Church House and the Little Red Brick Building. You know, the church in many ways was begun by a woman in 1862. We definitely don't minimize the contribution that Mary Gay made to this church, which has a wonderful legacy in the city, and you know, for more than 15 decades now, and so we owe her a great debt.
On one of her many fundraising trips, Mary was appalled to see cows trampling unmarked graves on the field where her brother and others had died, and immediately set about raising the money necessary to mark the graves and fence the field.
She had to do that for him because so much was being done so that her way of life could continue.
The end of Mary Gay's life consisted of struggles with her failing health. She died at the age of 98 and is buried in Decatur.
I tremendously admire Mary Gay's fortitude, her determination to do whatever it took to keep herself, her family, her neighbors, her community in food, surviving, thriving as much as she could.
She was passionate about her church, she was passionate about her family, she was passionate about her city, and she was passionate about the South.
She definitely belongs with the women of achievement because her achievement was beyond what the average woman would outwardly do. She had action. It was not just a secondary thought for her. Hers was taking it in her hand and doing. And that's what I think of Mary Gay. She does.